And we're on.
Okay. Okay, can you see the turquoise slide, Nate?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Well, first, I want to thank everybody for tuning in to my dissertation defense. I'm really excited to share this research with you all. And I'm going to go ahead and get started. So my dissertation research is on ecological and institutional landscapes of Andean bear conservation in Colombia. And when I was putting together this presentation, I was faced with the very important decision to about how to bring you into my research. And I decided that I would bring you along, starting with the same point that I came into doing this research, which is with the Andean bear. So they are the only bear species in South America. They are roughly the same size as the American black bear, if that helps contextualize at all. They are considered to be a largely herbivorous species, with approximately 90% or more of their diet being composed of vegetable matter, but they are known to opportunistically scavenge, and we now have reports of Andean bears actively depredating cattle and other animals, which will come up in a second. And then they also have these distinct facial markings, which are often on their face. When they do have these markings, it's actually unique to the individuals, which is interesting and useful for camera trapping. But it often occurs around their eyes, making some think that it looks like maybe they're wearing glasses. So that has earned them their other name, the spectacled bear. And so it's the same species, it just has two different common names. So Andean bears occur, as I said, in South America, as you might have guessed by now, along the Andean mountain range, in 5 different countries, from Bolivia all the way up to Venezuela. And within the Andean mountains, they are primarily found in 2 habitat types, the first being Andean cloud forest, and the second being something called paramo, which is a high altitude shrub ecosystem found only in the tropics. Andean bears are considered to be a species vulnerable to extinction, which means that while they are not endangered yet, experts believe they will be without intervention. There are approximately 20,000 Andean bears remaining in the wild. That is across all 5 of those countries where they occur. But I'll note that these data are disputed and not really based in high quality empirical data. And so these numbers are contested. They could be far fewer than this. And though we don't have the best data on their populations, we do know that the primary threats facing this species are related to habitat loss and then an issue of human-bear conflict. So that scavenging behavior, which I just mentioned, often implicates Andean bears in cattle deaths, and now combined with the knowledge that they will occasionally kill cattle, leads to human-bear conflict across the Andes. So all 5 countries which have Andean bears within their jurisdictions have programs and strategies in place to confront these threats and hopefully ultimately conserve the species. So in Colombia, the responsibility for conserving threatened and endangered species falls largely on the shoulders of these entities called Autonomous Regional Corporations, or CARs, for the Spanish acronym. And there are 33 of these CARs. Their jurisdictions are shown in the map on the right. And within each of their jurisdictions, these CARs act as the ultimate environmental authorities, and they are responsible for implementing national environmental policy. But, and this is important, they have a great deal of discretion as to the manner and the extent to which they implement this policy, being able to take into consideration their regional needs and realities. So this suggests that the conservation of the Andean bear might be a little bit complicated because the range of the Andean bear passes through the jurisdictions of 22 different CARs. In addition, Andean bears are also found within 22 different national natural parks, which are managed by a separate entity, Parques Nacionales Naturales. So regardless of whichever CAR's jurisdiction the national park is located within, the national park and the biodiversity within is managed by Parques Nacionales. So this suggests that there might be some issues related to fragmented management, and this is where my research comes in. So one way to talk about fragmented management is to say that there might be an issue of social ecological fit, which probably sounds more complicated than it is. It's actually this really intuitive idea that there should be alignment between ecological issues or systems and the institutions which are responsible for their management. And over time, 3 different dimensions of social ecological fit have been distinguished in the literature. temporal, which has to do with decisions being able to be made quickly enough to confront the problem as it's developing, functional, which has to do with how well interconnected ecosystem components are accounted for within institutional design, and then spatial, which has to do with the geographic alignment between these things. And my research primarily focuses on spatial social ecological fit. So, what happens if you have poor spatial fit? Well, the literature suggests a few different things. The first is that there might be a limited understanding of the extent of a problem. So, say an entity within its jurisdiction is looking at a problem that's developing, and they think it's localized when really it's part of a broader regional trend, which would suggest that they might not have the right strategies in place given the scale of it. The second thing is there might be an inability to coordinate for large-scale issues that require collective action across a landscape or a region, for example. And then finally, there might be a failure to account for externalities. So if an entity makes a decision and the ramifications of that decision happen outside of their jurisdiction and they're not aware of it, that's an example of an externality. So fortunately, researchers that have looked at this have documented that self-organization or voluntary collaboration can help entities overcome some of these issues of poor spatial fit. And this was what I wanted to look at in Colombia. So I had the question whether or not and to what degree these CARs have self-organized for the conservation of the Andean bear. And then I alluded to the fact that it's not just the CARs that are important, but also Parques Nacionales, and then, of course, local, national, and even international NGOs that are also interested in conserving the species. So I had this other question, can other types of actors help improve social ecological fit? And for me, these questions were embedded within a larger overarching question that guided my dissertation research, being how does the structure of the network of organizations ultimately impact their collective ability to conserve the Andean bear? So there are many different ways that someone could approach answering this question, and I adopted the social ecological fit lens. So to answer this question, I had three different components that I needed to put together. The first was to understand the structure and impacts of Colombia's model of environmental governance, which really helps contextualize the entire system. The second thing was to create a spatial model of the ecological system because I'm doing the spatial dimension of social ecological fit. And then finally, I needed to have a model of the social system against which I could compare the spatial model for that final analysis of social ecological fit. And these three components ended up becoming the three primary data chapters of my dissertation. So we're going to move through these one by one, starting with this. So this is a bit of the key background. These are what I see to be the two most important components of Colombia's national environmental system from the perspective of my research. So on the left, we have the Ministry of the Environment and Sustainable Development, known as the Min Ambiente. And they are the ones that are responsible for developing environmental policy in Colombia. And they are a centralized or national institution. And then, of course, on the right, we have all those different CARs, which are the ones that take that national policy and implement it, again, with lots of room for discretion. In addition to creating environmental policy and lots of other different things, the Min Ambiente has the additional responsibility to direct and coordinate the planning process and harmonious implementation of environmental activities of the entities of the national environmental system. And this is so that economies of scale are not lost among all the different CARs if everyone was just working independently, and also so that national environmental priorities aren't completely subverted by regional ones. The last key bit of information I'll share is that in 2001, along with a team of experts, the Min Ambiente created a national program for the conservation of the Andean bear. And like all other legislation, the CARs were to adapt this to their regional needs and realities. And this model of environmental governance in Colombia is one form of decentralized environmental governance. So I wrote about this in my first data chapter, the impacts of decentralized environmental governance on Andean bear conservation in Colombia. So I'm going to take a step back and talk about decentralized environmental governance for a second. So for those of you that like definitions, this is when a central government transfers powers to actors and institutions at lower levels in a political administrative hierarchy. And there are two key things that separate decentralized environmental governance from other forms of environmental governance. The first is that these lower level institutions need to have some degree of autonomy from that centralized government. So discretionary decision space is one possible way to do that. The second thing is some downward accountability to local constituents. So basically some forms of democratic participation. And in Colombia, this process of transferring the powers to these lower level institutions, being the CARs, occurred in 1993, and they were part of a broader global movement or shift to decentralized environmental governance. And there were several different reasons that people were advocating for this to become the dominant model. The first is that decentralized environmental governance was thought to lead to more rapid and informed responses to problems as they developed because decisions would be made at a more local level. The second thing was that there might be more local compliance because the rules would be better fit and not developed by some distant bureaucratic official. They argued that there would be a greater efficiency in the allocation of resources because the bureaucratic machinery is just a little bit smaller. And then finally, because of that downward accountability, it was believed that this form of governance would be more equitable. And when this was being advocated, it was primarily championed as a solution for the management of economically valuable resources like timber, like fisheries, natural renewable resources. And this is really important because with these natural resources, the sustainable management is implicitly motivated by the promise of economic returns. But decentralized environmental governance in the context of wildlife conservation is very different for a few reasons. First, wildlife conservation is extraordinarily expensive, often. Whether we're talking about anti-poaching units or paying for captive breeding efforts or paying for wildlife damage caused by the wildlife, it is a costly endeavor. And then contrary to the example of timber, for example, there are few immediately visible economic benefits. Now, that's not to say that wildlife have no benefits at all. They're just not captured as clearly as timber economic benefits are. And then finally, quite important for my dissertation research, wildlife are not well contained within jurisdictions. So given the model generally, it sort of suggests that decentralized environmental governance is just quite likely inherently going to lead to some issues of spatial fit when it comes to conserving or managing wildlife. And despite decentralized environmental governance being around for quite some time, very few people had looked at how the model serves for wildlife conservation specifically. And this was how I wanted to contribute to the literature. So I had a few different objectives in writing up this research in this chapter. The first were to assess the strengths and weaknesses of the Colombian model of decentralized environmental governance. This was primarily through a literature review. The second thing was to assess the impacts of decentralized environmental governance on approaches to Andean bear conservation. And thirdly, I was looking for opportunities to strengthen the network. And to gather this data, I spent 2 different field seasons in Colombia where I was interviewing practitioners. It was a cumulative 5 months spent in country. And I used a method called Snowball Sampling or chain referral sampling to get my interviews planned, which for me meant that I started with 2 NGOs that were the most prominent doing Andean bear conservation in the country, and I asked those NGOs to name all of their collaborators. And then I went to those collaborators and I interviewed them and I asked them to name their collaborators. And so you see this process grows exponentially, much like a snowball rolling downhill. And at the end of this process, I had conducted 67 semi-structured interviews with 71 different conservation practitioners in Colombia. These practitioners were representative of all 22 of those CARs that have Andean bear range within their jurisdiction, 20 non-governmental organizations, and then I also interviewed 12 employees of Parques Nacionales to understand the perspectives of their institution. And during these interviews, I asked about collaborators, who they exchanged information with about Andean bear conservation research. So not only was this key to my sampling strategy, but it was also data that I was after. And in addition to those kinds of relational data, I also asked them to describe the efforts that they had implemented for the conservation and research of the species and any challenges that they've experienced while implementing it. And I did a qualitative analysis for this chapter where I imported all of those transcripts into a program called MaxQDA for thematic coding. And I'm going to share with you just a few of what I see to be my biggest results from this part of my research. The first is that, contrary to many other situations, Colombia seems to have a genuine model of decentralization. So lots of times it's only like there are very little power is given to the lower level institutions, or it's just lip service and they're actually retaining all of the decision-making power. This is not the case in Colombia. So genuine decentralization. I have a couple primary arguments for saying this. The first is that CARs are largely self-financed. A study was done in 2012 that found that approximately 94% of the economic resources of the CARs were generated internally by the CARs, which means that 6% came from the central government, which means that with that 94%, the CARs have a great deal of discretion as to the way they want to spend that money. The second thing is that those CARs have a great deal of autonomy. And some authors, including the ones that I've listed here, have argued, in fact, that the CARs have too much autonomy, almost like Colombia has gone too far towards decentralization and have too much freedom, which is interesting and uncommon in the literature. The second thing that I found was a limited amount of leadership from the Minambiente. So if you remember, they have the responsibility to direct and coordinate the whole process. That did not appear to be happening to the extent that some think it should. So I have some interview quotes from practitioners at the CARs. The first one is in reference to that Andean Bear program in 2001. They had said, we keep waiting for the ministry to check in with us, about the things that they're doing, but there hasn't been anything. And then a second practitioner I asked to describe how the communication was with the Ministry of the Environment, what that looked like, and they told me simply, there is none. There is no communication with the Minambiente. The third thing I found was a largely haphazard implementation of conservation efforts, which could be related to the second point, but of course it's hard to prove causation. But often in interviews, the lack of programming or poor programming for Andean bears was blamed on disinterested CAR directors. So I have an example quote here where someone was telling me, there are directors that have no affection for wildlife, so they do very little. Meanwhile, it could be the contrary. I also received lots of different reports of Andean bear programs being initiated by one director who was excited about the species, only to be terminated 4 years later by the next CAR director who just didn't care. And so there's kind of this stop and go effort for programs that really should be long term. The fourth thing I found was that programming was driven often by fear of media or public reprisal following the death of an Andean bear in a CAR's jurisdiction. And then finally, I learned that an international NGO was the most influential actor among everybody I interviewed. So they were named more often as the source of information, the experts on this study, the people that are turned to when there are questions about this species. And this was not always viewed favorably, particularly by Colombian NGOs who felt like they were being unfairly outcompeted by this international NGO. So again, I have an example quote. Someone was saying that they have international funds, money that comes from outside Colombia. The national ones know we do not have any international support. We depend upon doing something with them, being the CARs. So a few conclusions to share with you. These are largely from the perspective of how there could be improvements for Andean bear conservation in Colombia. The first is improved leadership from the Minambiente would be probably quite helpful. The second thing is that more horizontal communication among the CARs would be helpful, more social ecological fit. And then finally, an increased amount of support channeled to Colombian NGOs. And this is because Colombian NGOs are more grounded in the local conservation community, and this could help improve the conservation program resilience in the country. So the second component, creating that spatial model of the ecological system. So we're kind of shifting gears here towards the ecological piece of my research. So what I was really after was a model of landscape connectivity for the Andean bear. And for those of you that aren't familiar with this concept, landscape connectivity is a measure of landscape permeability to wildlife movement. And if you're going to go about building a model of landscape connectivity, you would likely do so with the aid of something called a resistant surface, which tries to capture the way that different characteristics of the environment are more or less resistant to wildlife movement. So here's what this would look like in practice. We have an example map which contains data about our study area, in this case about the different land covers that are present. And to build a resistance surface out of this map, we would assign these different land covers different resistance values based on how they impact movement. So you would give the lowest resistance values to those that are most permeable or least resistant, and then the resistance values would become higher as the characteristic becomes more resistant to movement. And you wouldn't do this for just one set of characteristics like land cover. You would also try to assess what other characteristics of the environment could impact wildlife movement. So if you were modeling landscape connectivity for a species that didn't do well on really steep terrain, like a tortoise maybe, you would also want to consider something like slope. And you would do the same thing where you assign higher resistance values to the areas that are, in this case, steeper or more resistant to the tortoise movement, and lower resistance values to those flatter areas that are easier to move through. And so you would repeat this process for all the different characteristics that you know are relevant to your species, and then have a cumulative resistance surface that considers all of these different variables. And once you have this cumulative resistance surface, you can run some algorithms with it and then be able to predict which routes or portions of the landscape are most likely to be used by wildlife for movement. And there are a couple different algorithms that you could choose from. I opted for something called circuit theory. And what circuit theory does is draw parallels between electrical current and animal movement across the landscape. If you're using circuit theory to guide your model, you are assuming that the wildlife have imperfect or limited knowledge of the environment. So rather than having a distinct path in mind that an animal is just going to follow no matter what, circuit theory assumes that the animal is instead making decisions based upon what it encounters as it moves throughout the environment. And the last piece that differentiates circuit theory from some of these other competing algorithms is that circuit theory will consider the contribution of multiple paths while assessing landscape connectivity. So this is what that looks like in practice. And so this is a map of landscape connectivity modeled with CircuitScape, which is just the program that operationalizes circuit theory. And I'm going to draw your attention to a couple of things. The first is that there are two primary habitat patches that are delineated with that kind of mossy green color. And in this simulation, those two habitat patches are functioning as the electrical nodes. And so voltage is applied to one of them, and then the current will travel across the landscape according to the configuration of different resistance values in that intervening area. And so you can see that there are indeed several different paths that are being considered. And then when you're interpreting this model, the areas that have the highest current, which in this one are shown with that bright yellow, those are the areas that have the highest probability of use by wildlife. And this is primarily how circuit theory looks, with the two habitat patches being considered. But what I was after was different for precisely that reason. I was not considering how landscape connectivity looked between two national parks, for example. I wanted to know what it looked like across the entire Colombian Andean landscape. And fortunately for me, in 2014, Cohen et al. Developed a methodology that would allow me to do just that. So they developed a methodology for something called omnidirectional connectivity, sometimes referred to as wall-to-wall connectivity. And this is what that looks like. So you can see immediately, compared to that previous example, there are no two discernible patches, and instead current is kind of everywhere. It's all over the landscape. And this is what I was after. So the approach that Cohen et al. Used was they first delineate a study area, and then they buffered that study area. So they were essentially conducting an analysis of landscape connectivity beyond the area that they were actually interested in. And then rather than having those two predetermined habitat patches to function as the nodes, they assigned many random nodes at the perimeter of that buffer. And then they went through and did pairwise calculations of landscape connectivity, which all sort of look like that first example, but then they combined all those different maps together to produce the final map of omnidirectional connectivity, which should show you where wildlife are crossing the different landscapes in any given direction. No matter where they're moving, they're more likely to use the areas that have the highest current. The second thing that Cohen et al. Did in this paper that was really important for me was demonstrate that really generic models based on ecological integrity could be useful and valid. So ecological integrity is related to the intactness of the environment. It's sort of like the opposite of the human footprint. And oh no, someone's doing landscape outside. Hopefully it's not too loud. Okay, so if you remember that first example that I gave, this was essentially a model based on ecological integrity, where the forest was given the lowest value and then the highway had the highest. And it might have occurred to you that the numbers that I assigned seemed a little bit arbitrary. Like, why would agriculture be 10 times higher than forest, for example? And so normally what you would like to do is base these different resistance values on empirical data. So GPS collars are considered to be the gold standard. You can see where the wildlife are actually moving across the landscape and then be able to statistically assess how it relates to these different variables that are present. But if you remember in the beginning, I talked about how Andean bears are a relatively understudied species, which means that we don't have these data available, and that I would need to rely on some of these more generic and somewhat arbitrary resistance values. But as I said, Cohen et al. Had demonstrated that this was, in fact, a valid way to go about doing this. So they created a model of landscape connectivity very similar to that example, and then they got independent location data for several different species and were able to show that their model could predict where those locations would occur. So this was the approach I used in my second chapter, Omnidirectional Connectivity for the Andean Bear across the Colombian Andes. So I adopted those two primary aspects of the Cohen et al. Approach, being first modeling omnidirectional connectivity, and then second using those indices of ecological integrity. But I also, because I was interested in modeling landscape connectivity for Andean bears specifically, I did combine that with what little species knowledge we had. So following the Cohen methodology, the first step was to delineate my study area. This was pretty straightforward for me. I acquired species range data from the International Union of the Conservation of Nature, and I put a polygon around it. And then I had to assign those resistance values. So for ecological integrity, I was basing those resistance values on land cover, like that initial example, and then transportation being the major highways across Colombia. And then my species-specific data was really based on elevation, because we know that Andean bear habitat types occur primarily above 1,200 meters, and that Andean bears had never been observed below 200 meters. So that helped guide our resistance value assignments. And then I went through and constructed the three different resistance surfaces, the first being the land cover, that second one is the elevational range data, and that last one is highways. And I combined all those different resistance values together to make my final resistance surface. And when applying the Cohen et al. Approach, I immediately ran into my first complication. And that was that if I were to put a buffer around my delineated study area, I would then need to place nodes beyond the borders of Colombia, which I did not have data for. Potentially not even just one additional country, but 4, depending on how big the buffer needed to be. And this was just complicated for a bunch of different reasons. I also couldn't ignore it. I would, as much as I would have liked to. In a separate paper, Cohen et al. Had demonstrated that arbitrary jurisdictional boundaries could create artificial effects in circuit-based models, because it's essentially acting like there's an invisible wall beyond which animals cannot move past and then come back into the study area. And of course, that's not how borders generally work. But fortunately, again, in that earlier 2010 paper, Cohen et al. Had found that a random resistance surface could resolve some of these issues of arbitrary map boundaries. So this is what we did. We created a random resistance surface, which is that rectangle in the background, and the values in that resistance surface are similar to those found within our study area. And then because part of Colombia's border is in fact a coastline, we added an ocean buffer to acknowledge that reality, and that Andean bears in this case aren't going to be swimming into the Atlantic Ocean and then coming back. So this ended up functioning as our cumulative resistance surface. And I also had a very complicated and time-consuming process of figuring out how big the buffers needed to be and how many different random nodes I would need to use. And I just wanted to acknowledge that this happened because it took me several months, but we don't have time to go into the details of that today. So this was my final current map. For those of you that are interested, it was constructed with 78 random nodes at the perimeter of a 45-kilometer buffer. And when you're looking at this, again, remember that the areas with high current are those that are most likely to be used by wildlife, in this case being the Andean bears. So in my model, rather than it being yellow, it's those areas in blue that are more likely to be used by Andean bears. And the first thing that you want to do when you have your final model is to ask yourself if it makes any sense at all. And that's called a gut check. And my gut check was to compare my model to the initial range data from the IUCN to see if they aligned the way that I thought that they should. And for the most part, it looked pretty good. There's a lot of agreement between these two different data sets. But that's, of course, not enough. I would like to be able to validate my model and be able to statistically show that it's useful and reliable. But this raises the question, how do you validate a map when you have no data? That was the whole problem in the first place, and why I used this approach was that I didn't have great data on the species. So Nate and I talked this one out for quite some time, and we ultimately came against the question, well, how precise do the data need to be? And we decided, and argue in our paper, that it depends on what the model is going to be used for. And I knew from doing those interviews with conservation practitioners in Colombia that they often apply conservation programs at the level of the municipality, which suggests that my model needs to be valid at that level and not to some finer level like the meter. So I thought I might be able to find this kind of information, and I went to Google and I looked for anything related to Andean bears, spectacled bears, sighting. I also included some location keys like municipality and neighborhood to see what kinds of data were out there. And I found a lot. People were tweeting about the species. People were posting photos on Instagram about where they had seen the Andean bear. Local news outlets were sharing stories when the Andean bear was seen in one of their municipalities, this was all great. So I found 110 different records that mentioned 421 places that had seen Andean bears. And these places were all within 155 different municipalities. So we have 155 municipalities with records of Andean bears, 775 without. And because of the way that models of landscape connectivity and current work, you would expect there to be a higher average current in the municipalities that have Andean bear records than it would be in those municipalities without. So I did a very simple t-test to compare the mean values in these two different groups, and lo and behold, it was accurate, or it was true. So mean current was much higher in those municipalities that had records of Andean bears. So this was really good news. The second thing that you want to do to kind of help show the worth of your model is to do something called a sensitivity analysis. And what sensitivity analyses do is try to answer the question, how much does the model change when resistance values are adjusted? So if you remember, those resistance values were a little bit arbitrary. Well, what if they were off? What if instead of being 100 resistance units for agriculture, it was actually 50 or 150? If our model is changing wildly based on small tweaks to those resistance values, it would demonstrate that we did not have a very reliable model. So we tested how different changes to the resistance values for all of these different characteristics would change the model. So we tested one value at a time, changing the resistance. So for example, agriculture, we would decrease it by 50%, hold all else constant, rerun the model, see how much it changed. And this chart is of how much the models changed when we adjusted these values. The y-axis here is index of dissimilarity. So the higher the value, the more different the resulting model was. So to help interpret this, I'll draw your attention to the one that resulted in the most different model, and that was when we reduced agricultural resistance by 50%. The model was still 98% correlated with our original, which means that even though we changed agricultural resistance by 50%, our model was still really consistent and resilient to these changes, which is good. That's what we hoped and wanted to see. The second thing that we did was something called an uncertainty analysis, which tries to answer the question, how much might management decisions vary if the resistance values were off by, say, 50%? So this is something called an uncertainty analysis, and essentially what we did here was compare how often the same 25 municipalities were identified as most important to Andean Bear connectivity when these values were adjusted in the same manner. And across all of these different scenarios of changes to resistance values, we found 92% agreement about the municipalities that are most important. So again, drawing your attention here, in this scenario where agricultural resistance was scored as 50 rather than 100, the model had 82% agreement with the other models. Said another way, 18 of the municipalities that should be targeted for conservation would be missed if that was reality and one of the other models was used to guide decisions. So, help. Okay, so in conclusion, we were able to demonstrate that useful models can be constructed with limited data. You just have to be careful with how, first, that you're interpreting the outcomes, and second, that you're using the model in the manner at which it was intended. So my model is useful for guiding decisions for the municipalities. It would not be advisable to use it to guide decisions based on a meter-to-meter basis. Secondly, when you are dealing with limited data, social media and local news outlets could provide novel sources of course model validation when you're working with charismatic species. And then thirdly, because of how the sensitivity and the uncertainty analyses shook out, we can now say affirmatively that more information about how Andean bears move through agricultural areas specifically would be helpful in developing more informed and rigorous models in the future. So, moving on to the third and final component, creating a model of the social system for that final analysis of social ecological fit. So, if you remember from the introduction, I had asked these two questions about to what degree these cards had self-organized and whether or not other types of actors could help improve social ecological fit. These became my objectives for this third chapter. So the first objective, assess social ecological fit for Andean bear conservation, and then secondly, identify impacts of other kinds of actors on social ecological fit. So to construct first the model of the social landscape, I did something called a social network analysis. And I'm going to head this off and just say it had, this time, nothing to do with social media at all. And instead was something that looked more like this. So this is my favorite example, and some of you might recognize it at this point from previous presentations, but it's just the best. So a lovely person on the internet conducted a social network analysis on characters that had appeared in the Return of the King movie of The Lord of the Rings. So you can see immediately that there are different characters, their names are all there, but the characters are also represented by circles. And some of the characters are connected to one another by lines. And this indicates that those two characters at some point during the Return of the King had exchanged dialogue. And thicker lines indicate that those two characters had exchanged relatively more dialogue than others in the network. And then finally, the last bit of information that I'll draw your attention to is the fact that some names appear quite larger than other names, like Gandalf appears much larger, and that is because he talked to a greater diversity of people than any other character in Return of the King. And so he has, in this example, more social influence. So this was the kind of map of social connectivity that I was trying to, and did, construct for the institutions involved in Andean bear conservation and research. So my methods for this part were the same as for that first analysis where I conducted the semi-structured interviews with the practitioners. And this is where I used that data about collaboration and information ties. Basically, I was after anyone they talked to about Andean bear conservation and research. I tried to capture in this network. And this is a little bit results, but also an intermediary step. So I'm going to go ahead and share it here. But this was the social network among just the cars. So this shows cars who communicated with one another directly about Andean bear conservation or research strategies. And first thing that you can see is that it doesn't look very much like a network. Very few cars had communicated with one another about this subject, except for that nice little network on the eastern side of the Andean Mountains in Colombia. And I also wanted to remember to say that I had included, similar to the Lord of the Rings analysis, something called a strength of tie. So you'll notice that some of the lines are thinner than others, and that is because those communication ties were relatively weak, or they didn't talk to each other as much. Whereas the thicker lines indicate that they had a great deal of communication that was relatively consistent in the form of, for example, a collaborative agreement to work on the species. So the second thing was to take this social network and compare it against the spatial model. You should hopefully recognize this as my model of landscape connectivity from the previous section. But I wanted to turn this into a network because I had a social network and it's easier to compare two networks than it was to try to compare it to this model of landscape connectivity as it was. So to turn that model into the network that is pictured on the right, I looked at where those areas of high current were intersected by jurisdictional boundaries. So if at the border between two cars there were areas of this high current, I considered them to be ecologically connected. And that is because they quite likely share Andean bears that are passing back and forth between their two jurisdictions. So the network on the right is indicative of that arrangement of shared connectivity areas. So similar to the social network, there are strengths of ties here, but this time instead of it being based on communication, it's based on how much of that connective habitat was shared by the two cars. So thicker lines indicates that they shared much more of that high connective habitat, and thinner lines indicates that they shared very little of it. So I have my two networks and I can now compare them. So on the left, we have the social network. On the right is the ecological network. And we want to see whether or not the strength of the social ties and the existence of the social ties matches those of the ecological network. Because ideally, strong ecological connections would be matched by strong institutional connections. If they share very little habitat, it's less important for those two cars to coordinate with one another, for example. Whereas if they share a lot of it, it's probably more important that they communicate with one another. So you can see pretty easily that these two networks do not look very similar. There's a lot of mismatches between the two networks. And I was able to integrate all this information together into a single unified model. So this is a map of where there was alignment between the strengths of the ecological ties and the strengths of the social ties. So where ecological was stronger than social, those are all indicated in red. You can see there's a lot of red. Green and black indicate that there was communication where there should be, and potentially even where there doesn't necessarily need to be from this perspective. So said another way, there are far more mismatches than there are social ecological matches. And for those of you that like numbers, my quantitative people, I found that 53 unique pairs of cars, so not individual cars, but pairs, had shared connective habitat, but only 16 of these pairs, or just 30%, had communicated with one another about the species. And my qualitative data suggested that there were some consequences of poor spatial fit in this system. So first, people had talked about having incompatible data sets among neighbors. So they were using different methodologies to monitor their resident populations of Andean bears and wouldn't be able to compare their data or combine their data to get a more regional perspective of how the Andean bears are doing. The second thing that people talked about was a lack of institutional response at border zones. So I'm going to take a second and talk this one through. So at the borders, if an Andean bear has been suspected to kill a cow or has killed a cow, the ranchers are supposed to call the car to get assistance. But sometimes at the jurisdictional border zones, it's not clear which car they should call, and sometimes they call the wrong car. And I have heard stories about the car being called sends people out like they should, but then when they realize it's in the other jurisdiction, they just turn around and go home and don't notify the car whose responsibility it actually is to go out and talk to the ranchers. And this is problematic. It had been told to me in several different interviews that often rural Colombians feel alone. They feel like the institutions, like the cars, aren't there to help them. And so they might take matters into their own hands. And if they feel like their livelihoods are being threatened and nobody is coming to help them feel heard and to give them strategies for how to, deal with Andean bear depredation events, it often doesn't work out well for Andean bears. So this is a problem. And when you compare that to that nice network on the eastern range of the Andes, they talked about many positive things. They had the same research methodology, so they could draw conclusions about how Andean bears are doing across that broader range. They also had a shared protocol for responding to Andean bear depredation events, and they had established communication channels specifically for responding to some of these border zone incidents. So my research suggests that through this voluntary collaboration among these cars, they were able to overcome some of these issues of poor spatial fit. Now, about those other actors, because that was the second piece, right? Well, I found that NGOs and Parques Nacionales had far more connections than did the cars. So this is the complete social network that considers everybody that I found to be involved in Andean bear conservation and research. And you can see just immediately there's so much more going on here. There's a lot more collaboration. There's a lot more communication. This looks like a social network compared to that earlier example where there wasn't a lot of communication happening. So one of the important things I found was that when I included those other types of actors, I found what I'm calling hidden paths between the cars, which means that while the cars were not communicating directly with one another, they were connected by a shared correspondent or a series of shared correspondents, which is important because it means that information that is generated at one car could eventually travel to their neighbor or to the rest of the network more broadly. I found that 25 pairs of cars that had shared connective habitat and which had appeared disconnected in that original social network were connected by these intermediate correspondents. So some of the bigger takeaways from this, first and foremost, very few cars coordinated with their neighbors. It was not very common at all. But the cars were more likely to communicate or coordinate their efforts with non-governmental organizations or entities of Parques Nacionales. So because of those hidden paths, we can see that there's a possibility for information to be passed between non-communicating cars. And then finally, entities of Parques Nacionales and non-governmental organizations could work to foster coordination among their common correspondents. And this could be something as simple as when they're talking to a correspondent at a car and that person says, oh, we've been having this problem. The NGO, for example, could say, you know what, actually they were dealing with a similar problem next door and this is what they did and here's a contact for you to reach them and maybe you two should get together and talk about strategies. So something as simple as that could eventually lead to long-term coordination between these cars. And I wrote about all this and more in my third chapter, Non-Governmental Organizations Improve the Social Ecological Fit of Institutions Conserving the Andean Bear in Colombia. I didn't include that at the beginning because it kind of gives it all away. So that was my third and final piece of my dissertation research. And if I were going to take this a little bit further, here are what I see to be the next imminent questions to be answered. The first is how to build interinstitutional connections among the cars or other entities more generally. I gave that example about the informal communication and how that could help, but we need empirical data that really highlights how enduring partnerships could be formed, specifically or especially from the perspective of a third party that's interested in helping increase social ecological fit. And then these next two have to do with accountability. So mechanisms for upward accountability in decentralized environmental governance. That would be what mechanisms the MinAmbiente could use to encourage the hesitant CAR directors to comply with national conservation policy for Andean bears. And peer accountability has to do with how NGOs or Parques Nacionales might be able to sort of peer pressure entities that aren't compliant into compliance. So there are obviously lots of other questions that could stem from this research, but these are three that I wish I had been able to answer when I was writing up my discussions and conclusions. So I have many thanks to give out. First, to the funders, without whom this research just would not have been possible. Special thanks are due to Danielle, Valeria, and Melissa, who served as my translators during all of those semi-structured interviews. And then the Guarnizo family, who gave me just a wonderful home away from home while I spent all this time in Colombia. And then so many other people. So definitely need to thank my committee, Nate, Bob, Julie, Patty, and Dan, for all of their help and support. You all have helped me become a better researcher and hopefully better conservation practitioner. Thanks to Bob for believing in my potential to do a PhD, even though I was trying to do it without a master's thesis. And thank you to Nate for really just going above and beyond, being not only an amazing mentor, but a really good friend. Thanks to the Nibelink Lab, past and present, the broader ICON community. It's cheesy, but it's been a privilege to learn from and among you. And my broader Athens community. It was a really difficult decision to pack up and move more than 2,000 miles across the country to go to grad school, and I'm just so appreciative of the warm welcome that I received. Thank you, Dr. Jesse Abrams, Dr. Rocio Rodriguez Granados, and all my friends and family who have just been so supportive throughout this whole process. Like getting a little teary. Okay, with that, I will take any questions. Thank you so much.
Yay! Everyone virtually applaud. Take a deep breath, Rhianna.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. So I certainly invite people to turn on their video if they like, ask some questions. Now, Q&A will probably be easiest if I know you'd like to talk to Rhianna personally. So I will invite you to turn on your microphone and/or video if you prefer. Put a question mark or say I have a question in the chat so I can call on you so everyone's not doing it at once. If you cannot or don't want to turn on your own video and ask the question, you're certainly welcome to type the question in the chat and I'll be happy to read it to Rhianna for you. So feel free to just start putting a little indication in the chat and I'll call on you. I don't see anything yet, so I'm trying to drag this out a little bit. I know she just finished and you got to digest. All right. We got Angela. Angela, do you want to ask it in person or would you rather have me do it? Okay, I'll do it. Angela says, great presentation, to which I concur. 2 questions. How did you determine the stopping point for collecting interviews? And 2, any idea if or how often CARs in Colombia communicate with their counterparts in other countries within the Andean Bear Range?
Those are both really good questions. So the first one, you have to establish at some point something called inclusion criteria, which basically determines like, okay, another collaborator has been named, do I interview them also? And my cutoff point was, first, they had to be doing something relevant to Andean bear conservation and research. So sometimes people would be referenced as like, well, there are experts on sustainable timber, for example, and because it wasn't really like it was adjacent but not immediately relevant, I didn't include people like that. I also excluded lots of other kinds of actors. So municipalities and farmer associations were sometimes named, and just to try to keep it simple to those three categories, I didn't include any of them. And then once I was basically two ways out from my initial interviews, I only interviewed people after that point if they had been named by two people, to try to limit the growth of the network. So that was my approach. And then the second question was related to, I have forgotten. What was it?
Did cars in Colombia communicate with counterparts in other countries in the Andean Bear Range?
Yeah, so that was another really good question. The only people who volunteered that information were those that bordered Ecuador. And they had talked about having direct communication with the Ministry of the Environment in Ecuador, and they don't have cars in Ecuador or in a similar institution. So they work directly with the central government on that one. But nobody else mentioned it. But to be fair, I asked specifically about in Colombia. So I can't speak for sure about whether or not other people did.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Sydney, do you want to chime in?
Sure. First, congratulations. It was a wonderful presentation and very enjoyable. And the bears accompanying us throughout the entire presentation was just lovely. And so, great job. So I have a question about thinking about the cars' communication amongst themselves. And if you have any insights as to some of the limitations or difficulties for those cars communicating. So sort of like resistance, like sources of resistance for them, thinking about like landscapes or social factors.
Absolutely. So there were a few that I saw. First of all, it's hard to know who exactly to talk to at the neighboring cars, and I had a hell of a time tacking down like the people that I wanted to talk to. It was a huge bureaucratic institution. So sometimes I would call in and say, I'm trying to reach so-and-so, and I would get transferred around to like 12 different people before they were finally able to tell me that so-and-so's out on lunch or whatever. So if you don't know who to talk to, that is a huge barrier to getting any communication even started. Secondly, I know that there are some limitations as to the extent to which they could co-finance projects because of the way that their economics are structured. So they can't like have collaborative projects where they're both investing funding towards the same thing. And then what else? I had one more. Distances. That was one thing that was talked about in that network that was present. They talked about how hard it was to try to meet up in person because the face-to-face, as we all can attest to now, is better in a lot of ways to really building companionship and trust in one another. And it's really difficult to get from some regions of Colombia to another. We're talking about like 30-hour bus rides where they break down. Not everywhere is connected by an airport. So that's really difficult, along with like not great internet connections when you are trying to do virtual meetings. There were people that were just like, well, they were supposed to be here, but their internet's out. So there were definitely challenges that they had to overcome to coordinate with one another. Great question.
Thanks, Sydney. Jeff asks, did you look at other ways of calculating ecological connectivity besides omnidirectional connectivity via circuitscape?
I had actually, yeah, I did actually, now I'm remembering. Nate and I had discussed looking at like least cost paths between the cars, and it was messy to try to do. And ultimately we decided that the way that we went about it would be the most straightforward and most clear to describe. Yeah. So we looked at least cost paths for the social connectivity, but like how to determine the nodes, like does it matter if the two national parks are connected to each other, and what justifies them as choice as the primary patches? It was a lot to try to do it that way.
Any follow-ups, Jeff? I see you're off mute. Case.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I was actually more interested in the ecological networks if you tried something besides CircuitScape.
Ah,
Oh,
But
okay.
so you could do either, right? So you could have used a social network analysis type analysis for the ecological as well. So
Mhm.
yeah, definitely could have. Some of it was guided by the fact that I wanted experience doing circuit theory analysis.
sure, yeah, it's kind of the
Yeah.
standard right now.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on. Sarah Heisel says, that was amazing. I wondered what questions you used to quantify the degree of connection between cars, NGOs, or Parques Nacionales. It's okay. Let's see. Yeah, I guess that's it.
Okay.
What measures the degree of connection?
Yeah, sure. So like the strength of the institutional tie. That was difficult. It's one of the things that I would advise anybody doing this in the future to be really deliberate and know that you want strengths of ties and to ask like a very explicit questionnaire. Mine was based on, so I had 3 different strengths, and I ultimately decided that I would score them as weak or strong based on largely qualitative data and the way that they talked about the communication tie. So I assigned it as weak if they were saying like, well, we saw them last year at that one meeting and we had a good conversation, and I would, ask follow-up questions, and they say, well, no, we don't really, that was the last time I talked to them. I'm like, okay, so a year ago was the last time you talked. It's a weak tie. And the strong ties were things like, oh, we collaborate often. Yeah, we're texting all the time, and so over there is great. You should talk to them. A lot of those stronger ties were actually encapsulated within a large-scale collaborative agreement, which that was nice to have, to be able to say affirmatively that they were definitely really well connected. And if there weren't any of those indications of it being like really weak or really strong, I scored everything as average. So that was how I went about that, but
Cool.
could have been smoother.
Moving on to Shashir. Why is there a better match between the ecological network and the social network created by hidden actors compared to the social network created by cars?
I'm not, so I almost feel like I need a rephrase on that one.
So, Shashir, you want to chime in? Oh, you're still muted.
It seems like the NGOs are operating in a region where there is better ecological connectivity. Like the regions where the NGOs have decided to operate, like has an overlap with better Andean Bear connectivity compared to where the cars are operating. Is there a reason behind that?
Okay, I'm gonna look at my network again. So that's interesting. I haven't considered why that would be. I don't know why that would be. It could be just that there's a lot more need for NGO efforts in those areas, and that's why they're present and communicating and collaborating with those cars. But there are definitely NGOs that operate in different regions across Colombia, and I'm not sure why collaboration would. I feel like I'm not able to answer that question very well, but it is something interesting to look at for sure.
Go ahead.
The reason I ask is I'm like drawing some parallels with tiger conservation in India. Sometimes it seems like the NGOs deliberately want to be situated and work in an area where tiger densities are like marginal, where they want to improve, but some NGOs like go to areas with higher tiger densities so they are able to conduct research. So NGOs themselves are driven by different motivations to to spatially locate, and that might like inform why a NGO is where they are.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It wasn't something that I asked my NGO correspondents, like why they chose to work in a specific location, so I can't really help highlight that at all.
All right, I know some people are getting eager. I'll try to fit at least a couple more questions in here because there's a fair amount of interest. Sarah, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Me, Sarah?
Yeah, Sarah Horsley.
Hey, Rhianna. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. I joined a little late, so forgive me if you covered this, but I think that your pairing of social and ecological connectivity is extremely interesting and really compelling integrative research. I want to know if there were any approaches or tools that occurred to you in this process that were not currently feasible, but something in the future that would make your work really easy. Like in an ideal world, this is something that would make those pairings a lot more simple.
That's a really good question. I don't know as far as like new tools. I would certainly have done a couple things different had I known what I know now. Like I think a survey instrument for gathering social network data is a much more straightforward way to do that than just long, elaborate, semi-structured interviews. But that, of course, already exists. I just wish I had done it. So yeah, I don't know. That's a really good question, though.
Yeah, thank you.
Ryan Crawford.
Hey, Rhianna, great job. So many insights into achieving conservation at scale, and I really enjoyed hearing your thoughts on all of it. Going back sort of to the beginning, like first chapter, you mentioned two things that I thought were interesting. I wanted to hear more about. You said the Andean bear is sort of in that at-risk category, which it's not endangered, it's not listed yet, but it's heading that way.
Yep.
And then you said that, you know, in these interviews, it sounded like a lot of the resistance to wildlife conservation was the cost, right? People mentioned how expensive it is.
Yeah.
Did you ever hear people talk about how expensive it would be to not do wildlife conservation management in case it gets listed in the future? Because I know that's a big issue in the US based on our policies. I have no idea what Colombian policies are, but just curious if that came up.
It didn't at all. People, they did talk about the limitations of resources in nearly every interview. But yeah, they didn't talk about how much more expensive it could be later on if it was listed. Although I think it is, so Colombia considers within its country that Andean bears are technically endangered already. So if anything had happened differently from that, like it's kind of already flown the coop.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, one more question because it's a great question. Lydia asks, did you experience any negative communication or resistance while conducting interviews being a non-Colombian researcher?
I will say no, which I am very grateful for. No, it seemed like I was sort of welcomed in, which was surprising for a couple of reasons. One is there's a lot of competition in the Andean bear conservation world, but because my project was so weird to them, they were like, I don't really know what you're, like, they didn't really understand what I was after, despite like my trying to explain it. So I think I wasn't viewed as a threat in that way, whereas if I had been like a very traditional ecologist trying to study Andean bears, it would have been quite different, I think. But no, I'm quite fortunate that I didn't encounter any resistance to my being there and asking questions. People were really welcoming.
And in fact, the places we did inquire about some of the more ecological interests were met with a little bit of resistance. That's another story. Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it. Thank Rhianna one more time for an inspiring presentation.